Hello and welcome to AI is Transforming Advertising, how top brands boost click-through rate by 324% and return on ad spend by 28%. So today's webinar is sponsored by Uniphore and produced by SmartBrief. My name is Scott Becker with SmartBrief, and I'm excited to be your moderator for this webinar. So we've got a lot to cover today. We can't wait to get started, but first we do want to go over a few housekeeping details that are going to help you get the most out of the session. So let's start out in the chat tab on the far right-hand side of your screen. A lot of you have already been saying hi in there. We love to see that. If your state or country seems underrepresented, you can correct that by giving us a greeting in there. So that chat is for hellos like that, but obviously don't stop there. Please share your thoughts about today's topic, your reactions to the insights from our presenters, whatever you're excited about. Drop it there in the chat. That's also a good spot to go if you have any technical issues. So browser refresh will fix a lot of minor tech gremlins. Another thing to try is that light mode option at the bottom of your screen. That limits some of the functionality, puts you on a slight delay, but it can really help if you're having connection problems, even local ones. And if none of those steps fixes a problem for you, my colleague Irina and I are standing by to help you out. We'll be monitoring that chat for any issues that you might have. Now, as always, the best way to dive into the information we're going to explore today is by asking questions. So let's take two hops over there in the tabs from chat. There's a Q&A tab. So while chat is for just all that general stuff, Q&A is where you should go if you've got a question for our expert presenters. That's the queue that we'll look at during the Q&A portion of the event. And now we do have a lot of info to cover today, maybe a demo, and so depending on how many questions we get, we may not get to them all during the session. If that's the case for your question, don't worry, we'll make sure to pass along all of those questions to the team from Uniphore for follow-up. Now, another stop on our console tour today is the Docs tab. There's some great materials in there. There's a guide for marketing AI transformation in the role of CDP. It's a nice 22-pager, just lots of detail, but not too much. It's sort of that perfect sweet spot for the amount of information just to dig in to some of the stuff that you'll hear about today. Now, we'll also just be aware that we have closed captioning available in 18 languages. If you hover over the lower part of your screen, you'll see that CC option as well as the drop-down menu for languages. And finally, you may have noticed here this prize icon. We are in fact giving away an Amazon gift card worth $250 as a prize drawing at the end of our webinar. Now, you must be in attendance for the duration of the live event to qualify for the prize, and you've got to meet the SmartBrief prize terms and conditions, which you could find in the Docs tab as well. Okay, with all that housekeeping out of the way, I think we're ready to get into a robust discussion of how AI is transforming advertising. We've got two perfect people to explore this topic today. We've got Joe Polikel, who's Director of Product Management at Uniphore. And we've got Zachary Van Doren, who's SVP of Product Strategy and Ecosystem at Acxiom, where he leads the growth of the company's data and identity offerings across data cloud, ad tech, and MarTech ecosystems. Joe, Zach, thank you guys both for being here today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Scott. Good to be here.
Joe, let me turn things over to you to sort of quickly frame up our discussion today, if you don't mind.
All right. Yeah. So thanks so much, Scott, for the introductions and for kicking us over. I actually wanted to start this discussion with maybe what me and Zach have been very, very familiar with, right? Like, I mean, we both have worked for customer data platform organizations in the past, and we continue to do that. And so maybe I wanted to start this conversation where I'm like, hey, CDPs were supposed to be the central nervous system for marketing, right? And I think for many of our customers, many of our listeners, it still is. But if you look at the advertising ecosystem, right, I get the sense that CDPs never really cracked it, right? And it's come close, but it's still, there's a lot of lacking things. Now, ultimately, all marketers, including advertisers, require intelligence, right? And so the key thing that I was going to kick this off with is, hey, why was that a gap, right? Where are the places where CDPs need to kind of go beyond what it does today? Now, when we think about the CDP in general, right, it has omni-channel marketing capabilities, it has segmentation capabilities, data context capabilities, centralization of data, and customer 360. And so if I think about this advertising engine or the ad tech world or the ad tech industry, which is like $1 trillion globally, that market mostly operates outside of the CDP, right? A lot of the things in advertising, like lookaliking, prospecting, media buying, frequency control, optimizations, I don't see a lot of CDPs kind of touching those functions, right? So is CDP the wrong tool, or is AI like the missing link between the CDP and getting to these functions? So I was wondering, Zach, since you are very close to this world,
Yeah.
you've worked with 100 advertisers, right, or hundreds of advertisers, and what is your point of view? Like, why do you think CDPs never became that backbone?
Well, thank you, Joe. Yeah, and my background, way back when I was a media planner, buyer, strategist, way back when, right? And then I eventually went into the data side, and then from the data side, I went into the CDP side. So I was able to see it very much from both lenses, right? And I was around in the CDP space when it first began to build as its own category. And I think you need to look at the historical underpinnings of what was the original premise of a CDP, which was to empower and democratize the first-party data to the end user, to the business user, to the marketer, right? All this underlying customer first-party data was always traditionally kind of locked down, inaccessible to those marketers, and it created a ton of inefficiencies relative to being able to run activation when they had to constantly ping IT and data teams to build audiences and receive audiences, right? And so, yeah, that the premise was to build this foundational C360, right? And there's ingest components, there's ID resolution components, and then there's a UI on top of that that allows that accessibility, right? And so that then allowed the core function of audiencing, right, which is to, in a very easy drag and drop manner, build the audience and then to syndicate the audience, right? Awesome, great, fine, right? But then you very quickly run into limitations. So one limitation is just by the fact that you're sitting on first-party data, right, which is deterministic, which is based on PII, first name, last name, email. And much of the ad tech world at the time was not operating in with those identity signals, right? And so the way it worked at that point was to build their audiences, syndicate their audiences, and most of the syndication was mostly in the context of areas and channels that are addressable with PI, which is email, right? SMS, text, maybe some like call center, maybe web personalization, those kind of mid bottom funnel areas, right? In the really more in the retention space, right? And then it was, okay, if you want to activate that data into paid media, okay, great. Then you send it to a third-party onboarder. Then that third-party onboarder would translate all that PI into a separate ID space. And then that would be pushed out into the full walled garden programmatic social displays, right? And so I could go on for an hour just on this, but you very quickly run into limitations, right, in that regard. So.
Yeah, and that makes sense, right? Like, and so, and before kind of getting into like more of that detail, I actually wanted to, I want to click on a few of those. That's actually different, right? Because there's probably three, if not more than at least three primary reasons why people advertise, right? It's not all equal, right? We talk about advertising sometimes as if it's all one thing, but it's mostly three different jobs from my vantage point, and would love to kind of see if you agree and if there are more things we should consider. So the first one is brand awareness, right? So I'm like, hey, I want to be able to build memory structures within my base of folks that want to do business with me or like my brand. I want to have emotional associations. And a lot of that don't rely on some of these IDs, right? To your point, first-party data, is this probably the domain for the CDP? I don't know, right? The second one is more around acquisition and maybe like intent harvesting, right? How do we get in front of customers or consumers or prospects that have intent, right? Either they're showing early signs or they're somewhere in the middle of the funnel. And that is all driven by signals, right? Some of those signals are first party, others are not. And then the third bucket is growth and retention, if you will, where you have now your cross-sell motion, upsell motion, your win back, your retention motions. And these are mostly done in own channels on known users, but there is a buying group that you target, folks that sort of pseudo influence decision making, right? And so that's where I've seen CDPs provide the most value, right?
Yeah.
So if you go deeper into those three
Yeah.
constructs, would you agree?
Yeah, totally agree. Brand awareness, right? I mean, that you can very quickly associate that with the big broadcast buys, the big out-of-home buys, right? Really driving brand association, emotional connection, right? Trying to build as much, I would say, person-based targeting relative to your audience and your target audience against what you're selling as possible, right? And so that's traditional domain of TV and print and at home and all that stuff, right? Then you get into, okay, you have some brand association, then you want to get in front of people who are who are either explicitly qualified or explicitly in an intent to purchase cycle, right? So think car manufacturer, right? And so they of course want to get emotional connection and brand awareness relative to the make and model, so that when the user or consumer is in a purchase cycle, years long, it could be years long purchase cycle, they have that brand association, and then they're looking and researching and doing searches and looking at videos. You absolutely want to get in front of that person, right? So that is sort of the idea of intent, kind of mid-funnel intent based in market-based qualification and targeting, right? That, and then you sort of get into, okay, what were the mechanics in order to functionally enable that process through programmatic, through internet, right? And so then, of course, you very quickly get into third-party cookies. You get into their traditional technologies that were built on top of third-party cookies to really drive that. And that used to be the big domain of the DMPs that were a big category, and they all kind of collapsed when third-party cookies went away, is using third-party cookies as a means to kind of collect and harvest behavioral kind of signals with ID signals, right? That will allow you to, one, build an audience relative to contextual and signal-based intent, and then two, with the third-party cookie being able then to address that, to target that, right? So all that went away, right? And then yes, growth and retention. So either they're further deeper in the funnel, maybe they visited a website, maybe they're a previous customer, right? Then you're getting into the first party pseudonymized and known context or identity world, if you will, right? And CDPs definitely can play well in that space, right? Certainly also CDPs have endeavored to move further up into that second bucket, right? And be kind of that the means to get into sort of the third party identity state. But there's other limitations here, right? Because all this is not just about syndication of audiences, right? It all is about achieving relevancy of experience, right? And so you quickly get into, okay, you have the relevancy in the context of the person, relevant in the context of the creative and the messaging or the experience, and relative in the context of place, of medium, of channel, of destination, right? And so the advertising function has to be able to workflow and synthesize and coordinate all of those elements of the person, the place, and the message, right? So you have that element, right? And then you have, I would say blocker, where I think this is where AI is a big unlock for in the context of the CDP. Is all great and fine to have the functional capability to create an audience and then some CDPs have really taken that further and allowed basically journey design and orchestration and delivery, right? So, audience, and then we're coordinating the rule sets around touch point, sequential messaging based, touch points that could be a blending of email and paid, for instance, right? I know Uniphore has gotten deep into that, right? But the problem and challenge becomes, okay, it's just not just enough to create the audience. It is the planning and insights that go behind that informs what audience you create, right? It's not just enough to create a journey. It's the planning, it's the insights, it's the analysis that goes into what journey to create, right? And that is a big blocker, right? Because if you, in providing the marketer access to those data foundations, going back to the historical original premise, awesome, great. But then it's also, there's a flip to that, right? And so when you provide a marketer, business user, UI accessibility to what could be millions and millions and millions of rows and hundreds of thousands of columns of data, that it's a very heavy cognitive load to be able to then discern, okay, what do I do with that data, right? What audience do I create? What journey do I create? Like, it's so, you can imagine, you very quickly get into a blocker. So all of this is just mixing together relative to, the inability to scale further than that, right?
Yeah, I was just going to ask, Zach, so my understanding is that CDPs have only been used for one real advertising use case, which is suppressions. How can a CDP go across the other use cases that we've been talking about here?
Yeah, I mean, its core is suppressioning, right? They've gotten into the retargeting function. Again, if you look at the data they sit on top of, customer data, right? There's a whole use case or set of use cases in around, let's say, like cross-sell and upsell and churn and retention. So there's the whole gamut of first-party based advertising use case. There's another one, lookaliking is another one, right? Where you're using your first-party data as a seed, then to synthesize against what would say a universe of prospects. So there's a host of use cases, right? But you're right. Suppressioning has sort of always been the low-hanging fruit, the first thing you do to get immediate value and ROI, right? And that goes back to relevancy, the importance of relevancy, the importance of qualification. So of course, you want to be able to suppress, which basically means to not waste money against your current customers when you're trying to reach new customers, right? Of course, right? And so it just became an easy button way to get that first party suppression audience, if you will, and syndicate that across, right? Universe, right? Easy, right? You don't really need to think about it, right? You just do it, right? But why hasn't scaled beyond that? And it goes back to the point of, okay, well, you want to scale beyond that, then you really need to put some planning and processes and insight and thinking behind what audience do you create, like what journey do you create, all relative to those original goals and objectives, right? So if it's a cross-sell, right, objective, great, upsell objective, great, but then it's, again, what do I do, right? What audience do I create? What journey do I design, right? How does it correlate to messaging? How does it correlate to our media mix? How do I take all that, extract, basically the performance extract that occurs in the context of the buy, the impressions, the added, engagements, all that, the clicks, all that is further breaking down by, time of day, by channel, by creative size, right? Just a ton of exhaust that comes out of that. How also then I bring all that data back, join it back to that data foundation, how then does that incrementally affect the journeys and the segments that have been created, right? So that closed loop hasn't been really realized that would really also facilitate that. I mean, all that is to say that to do that without the use of AI, it's a heavy cognitive load to be able to really accelerate that at scale, right?
Yeah.
Again, Joe, we could go 5 hours on this, but that's just the high level,
So,
right?
But these are good points, right? So what I'm really hearing, right, in order to truly kind of expand into making this for advertising, making it friendly for the advertiser, the capabilities. And I was kind of just thinking about all the different things you mentioned. You mentioned planning, budgeting, forecasting. You mentioned audience discovery. You mentioned optimizations, and you mentioned sort of like bidding and pacing intelligence, right? Like those are all capabilities that you need to have. What is your point of view? Because the measurement, right, like you talked about, is very, very dependent on common currencies, which we are seeing across the world,
Yeah.
right? Like across the globe, but also then identities, right? In When I'm targeting folks, especially when I'm doing advertising, I kind of feel it's two things, right? It's probabilistic and deterministic IDs, and I'm not talking about
Yeah.
ID resolution. I'm talking about more of like deterministic IDs like emails and hashed values of phone numbers and so on and so forth, where I know that this particular thing belongs to a person. But then there's the probabilistic part of, I think I know who I want to target, and here is like a broad segment I want to go reach out to. So there's that aspect versus in the known world. Can we double click into that a little bit, Zach? Because I think that, along with third-party data marketplaces, is like a huge thing, and that's also something that you currently do, right? So how do we bring that into this conversation that we are having?
Oh yeah. Highly complex, and that you're also getting at why measurement is so difficult, right? So there's the extrapolation of all that performance data, and then there is, okay, how do I join that back to my originating set of data foundation? How do I build an evolve intelligence that I own, that then I can then to iterate and tweak and perfect all the components of media, the channel, the person, the messaging, the audiencing, all that, right? You have deterministic, you have probabilistic, so the traditional definition is deterministic is just an exact match of high confidence, right? So we know Joe is Joe. We know Joe's email is tied to this customer ID or this loyalty ID or whatnot, right? And usually deterministic is based and used for marketing that requires high precision, high accuracy with extreme confidence, right? Think call centers, right? Think clienteling apps. Think in-person retail experience, right? Think, of course, email, right? You got to get that right, right? And it has to be precise, has to be accurate. You can't be looking at a customer record that's not germane and accurate to the person you're talking to. You just can't, right? Probabilistic is literally probable signal, right? So it's matching with degrees of confidence that are at a sliding scale, is what it means, right? And so it allows you to maximize reach and targeting in a way that you can balance the need for accuracy and precision, right? There's a sliding scale of that, right? So I could say my name, for instance, right? I have full name is Zachary, but it's botched everywhere, right? Sometimes it's Zach, sometimes it's Zach with a CK, sometimes it's Zach with just a K, right? So you can say, okay, a Zach versus Zachary is a probable match, and that probable match is done with a high degree of confidence, right? And then you can also take it further. Okay, we think this device ID is ties to Zach, but our confidence relative to that match would be 50%, 60%, right? And so you can play with the sort of the levers of probability and confidence scoring, right? And the more you play with those levers, the more scale you get, right? The more coverage you get, right? And so in the context of advertising, when you're trying to really drive, again, scale of insofar as moving the needle on a specific objective, whether it be incrementality or or market share or whatever, you can afford to have an allowance for like non-precise confidence on a matching. Like again, I can go on and on, but and so when you think in this, you look at this in around measurement, right? Then you get into, okay, how do I take all that data and then how do I join that back, right? And so you can say, okay, some of this data might be tied to a device ID. Some of it might be tied to an IP address. Some might be tied to an audience grain or a channel grain, right? And so you'll have data coming out that will be able to join at either varying degrees of match accuracy or confidence and varying degrees of granularity. Like by granularity, I mean at a profile grain, maybe at an audience grain, maybe at a channel grain, right? And then again, you can imagine what a sheer complexity this means insofar as a market to be able then to react to that, right? Let alone having a common foundation to do that, right? The walled gardens, like, absolutely do not make this easy, right? They all want to keep that and maintain a mode of that underlying data, right? They certainly don't want you to extract and get that data at a profile grain, because that means that introduces risk for them relative to moving media dollars out somewhere outside, right? So that all creates a lot of complexity. And again, like AI provides a very interesting and unlock, I would say, to just a couple areas. One, just the underlying complexity and challenge of having to kind of harmonize all that data, right? So to extract it, to join it, to structure it into a proper common foundation, and then to be able to then have measurement, insights, and extrapolation of that, and then be able to then connect that insight extrapolation to an actual action, right? And you can imagine with just kind of humans in a loop, right? Just how hard that is, right? And so these are all big unlocks.
So Zach, talking about some of that, you work for one of the largest data providers. How do you see Axiom and Uniphore solving for this?
Yeah, we are a data company, right, at heart, right? Uniphore is technology at heart, right? So we're kind of the oil and to their engine, right? And we're very much in the business of enabling the proper and requisite data foundations on two ends, right? So first end is the sort of going back to the C360, right? The ability to create a fully addressable and fully maximized profile from an intelligence standpoint to really enable relevancy. All goes back to the relevancy of experience, right? And so working with Uniphore, that's connected to on the brand side, that's doing all the block and tackling and ingesting and stitching and normalizing the first party data. We come in and we very much optimize and accelerate that core process, right? So that's on the one side. On the other side, to Joe's point on measurement, right? Then we provide ability to also hygiene and optimize that process of extraction, joining, and then insight and intelligence, ideation and extrapolation within that data set, right?
Gotcha.
So that's a very core. I can keep going, but that's so the top line how it's.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I feel like on a lot of this, we're scratching the surface. There's so much more to say.
Yes.
Yes.
Joe, another thing that's important to fix is waste. How do you think of reducing waste with AI realistically?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. I mean, that is some of the toughest questions our customers ask us to solve for. Zach, would love to kind of get your color as well on this. And you and I have been in a lot of conversations around this, right? But let me kind of break it down. So when we think about waste in advertising, right, it's not just about frequency caps and bad targeting, right? They are issues, but it's also about bad qualification, and a lot of times it's about bad timing. And so when we think about AI and how we want to fix about this, right, let's kind of break it down into a few of these ways. So first one is qualification waste. So qualification waste meaning, hey, we're targeting the wrong people, right? Not to be confused with just pure suppressions, right? This is qualifying people in and out of campaigns, right? Like when we say people, we're talking about cohorts. We know there are some folks that are the never converters, right? They're never going to convert. Some people who are just not in the market at this point in time. That's where some of these intent signals that Zach was mentioning earlier kind of come in. There are some signals in the market that exist where we know that they have been engaging with a competitor or have purchased the competitor product very recently. There are people who are outside of the category that we want to target, right? So there are so many signals that we need to use to be able to minimize that qualification waste. Now, I was actually reading a study done by ANA that said about 60% of like programmatic impressions were produce uh, zero incremental lift, right?
Yeah.
And that is primarily a qualification failure. So when we think about AI to solve for this qualification failure, qualification waste, we have to think about how do we predict in-market signals at the right time. How do we think about predictive models that can predict conversions or the likelihood of conversions? How do we identify these never converters and what do they look like? And can we change behavior by targeting them appropriately? How do we then basically look at all these different signals that we can potentially leverage and cut through that noise and say, hey, here are the things that we really, really want to anchor on. So that's one. The second one, which is a big component, is timing. So wrong time, wrong moment, right? And we may have the right person, but it's not the right time for them, right? This could be as simple as someone who just converted yesterday, right? Hey, maybe we should not run something for them tomorrow, right? Let's say we've targeted somebody more than 10 times on a particular day or in a particular week. Someone who's probably at a different stage in their journey, right? So we need to be able to like look at those signals to be able to then say, hey, how do we use that and make sure our timing is appropriate? We had one example with a customer that we were working with where they were running the campaign just at the wrong time in the day. So here is where we can actually look at dynamically suppressing people who are right, but maybe they're not going to the right touch point at that moment. So that's where I look at AI and say, hey, how do we predict fatigue? How do we then look at recency with respect to how much we've kind of exposed them to content and creative? How do we then adjust frequency in real time to be able to run these campaigns more effectively, reducing that timing waste? Uh, then I can keep going on the creative waste, right? Hey, right person, right time, but wrong creative or wrong message. So the title of our conversation today is that 324% increase, right, from a CTR standpoint. This is what one of our big large customers fixed. So all they did was they looked at, hey, how are people browsing their website? What are the top 3 products people are looking at? And how do I run campaigns based off of that, right? So how do I take that and personalize that using AI to be able to run the right campaigns? And that is the result. That 324% uplift was from that personalization. So where AI kind of comes in here is how do we score the creative fit based on a campaign that we run? Is it using the right signals? How are we personalizing the message for the context and the moment in time, right? And then finding what themes like drive that incrementality versus just kind of putting some generic message outside in the campaign itself. The last one I want to talk about, the last actually 2 I want to talk about, and Zach kind of talked a little bit about this. One is measurement waste, and the second one is identity waste. So measurement waste is if I don't know or I can't measure something, then I'm not able to eliminate that waste, right? Because we don't know if it is occurring. So here is where I truly feel AI fixes that measurement with causal models, with that real-time incrementality, with probably putting a continuous learning loop and guardrails around that to be able to then say, hey, here is how I am truly running a lift-based optimizations on my existing campaigns. And that requires the second thing, which is identity, right? You need to have and understand how your prospects and customers are going through all these different touch points and journeys and tactics and strategies that you put together. And so here, how do we denoise, right? How do we remove the noise from the ecosystem? So it's a very quiet source of waste, identity, but we often unknowingly compete with ourselves sometimes when you're running these campaigns, right? So things like, hey, two cookies could be the same person, right? That's an identity waste. There's duplicate devices. That's identity waste. There's sometimes cross site campaigns that we may want to run, right? Paying twice for the same user on the same platform for conversions, or sorry, for impressions. So those are all things that we need to identify upstream so that we can then be more efficient. Zach, would you agree?
Yeah, agree with all that. Agree. I mean, I would add a few more. I mean, one is there still very much is the problem in the market around siloed data, right? That is proliferated by applications that are point level, if you will, single threaded, right? So the idea of centralizing and unifying, creating kind of horizontal data foundations that the CDP would basically be on top of, and then connecting all the applications that are in the business of performing all these requisite workflows across these journeys, right? So being able to connect and tie the touch points and the experiences relative to the person being in the prospect versus being in a website visitor versus being in a known customer. There's very much silos and disconnected journeys and disconnected data components and disconnected processes and teams, right? So there's still all that. All that is driving inefficiency and non-relevancy and waste. So it's very much a people, person, process component to all that as well.
Yeah, Joe, it's a good time to maybe talk a little bit about how Uniphore is addressing that problem, or was there anything else that you wanted to talk about here with based on what Zach just said?
Yeah. So at Uniphore, we are evolving the CDP product, right? So Uniphore acquired ActionIQ, a leading CDP provider, last year, and since that time, we've been evolving and going beyond what we've traditionally done. So the customer data platform has three primary things that it solves for, along with all the stuff that we talked about earlier in our conversation here. It's customer 360, segmentation, orchestration, centralization of all of that. And as we kind of started to think about, hey, we want to be a tool that can solve for more problems, we started looking at definitions of, hey, what exactly do we have right now, and what are the problems it solves for, and how do we evolve to this, to solving for more and going to that next frontier. So as we were thinking about that, we said, hey, you know what, when CDP started, we always considered the CDP as a system of records that sits on top of system of transactions and then does its centralization, right, from a data context standpoint, and then you can run campaigns based off of it. When I looked at that, it sort of fell very squarely in, hey, I as a marketer, I have an idea. I've already gone through that planning exercise, and then I want to go and execute on that planning exercise. And so you come into the CDP, you execute it, and then you're running the campaign, right, through those integration points that a CDP brings to the table. And then you're doing it across channels, and you're doing that omni-channel behavioral-based splitting in some cases. Other cases, you're doing linear programs and so on and so forth. So as I kind of look at our evolution and what we wanted to kind of evolve into and where we wanted to go, which was earlier in the year, we said, hey, this system of records is great, but we really want to start getting into that planning workflows. We want to get into measurement workflows. And so where we've kind of evolved to now and where we are right now is we are definitely a CDP at the core, but we moved and evolved into a system of intelligence for the marketer that helps with data, context, intelligence across these workflows, across that planning workflow, across that execution and execution optimization workflow, and then sort of closing that loop with measurement that then goes back into planning. So that's where we are evolving. So if we go back to what we discussed, right? Advertising is mostly about context and moments, and the missing layer between that data and context and moments is that intelligence layer, and that's what we've been seeking to build, and we have early versions of it that some of our customers are leveraging. And this is where we looked at some of those metrics to say, hey, how do we personalize these moments that are running on these paid channels so that we can get the best uplift, the best conversions, the best efficiencies. But the reality check in all of this discussion, and Zach kind of alluded to this earlier, one is difficult, but we are not doing this by ourselves, right? This is where we have an ecosystem, and organizations like Zach come in to like help with driving the technology that is us with the data backing that Axiom or Zach's organization kind of brings to the table. But Zach, I mean, feel free to add anything that I may have missed there.
I would just double down, underscore on bringing intelligence that drives action in the CDP is absolutely key and crucial. And towards our earlier question on how do we unlock this? Like how do we unlock what I think is kind of a plateau in the CDP's ability to really affect and drive kind of advertising as a use case function, right? Again, it's not just the ability to create an audience, syndicate the audience, the ability to create a journey. It's right. Then goes into how do we design it? What audiences do we create? And then what journeys do we create? And how do we iterate and tweak that and evolve that relative to performance data coming in, right? If we can, that is the big unlock. And if we could do that at a person level basis, and if we can do that at scale, right? So think of it just the common data foundation of a enterprise brand. Think of the millions and millions of rows in that, and think of the ability to personalize the journey on an individual basis at true scale, right? So that for me, that's the big one, right? That's the big one.
In fact, I actually have an early version of this planning, execution, measurement component that the team has been working on. We're very close to potentially releasing this. I would love to show it to you. Let me share my screen.
Oh, great.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So this is our platform, the Uniphore's marketing AI platform. So I've got an agent in here, and let's say I'm a marketer. I'm looking at my website visitors, and I'm seeing like, hey, you know what? My conversions or cart abandonment is increased. I'm seeing lesser checkouts, but I'm seeing an increase in the number of people that are coming in. So I want to like start to plan, but also then execute on a campaign and then see how it does. So I come in here, I can say, hey, I am seeing a lot of website users, but they are not converting. Can you help to increase conversions? Right. So let's say I start with that vague objective. So here is where, this is not just about assistance, right? This is more about, hey, let me actually think about this and let me look at your data before I start to give you suggestions. So here is where it starts with, hey, here are some insights. And then from there, let's kind of work through, ideate through how we want to actually target folks. So here it's kind of come back and said, so our marketing AI agent has come back and said, hey, seeing some anonymous visits and 20% sign in, but we are able to sort of look at their anonymous sessions, and there's some authentication that has happened in the past. So that 20% is actually not 20, it's probably higher, right? So we can actually now do more known targeting. So you have more power of first party data, but then it's giving you general statistics on, hey, what is the category of product pages that are driving the traffic? What are some patterns within the known visitors? What are patterns within different types of devices, and so on and so forth. So I'm like, you know what, this is all great. I'd love to continue the conversation here, but let me look at what are some campaign options or what are some strategies that my agent kind of tells me. Like, so say, hey, uh, here are some campaign options that it then comes up with and says, hey, you know what, based on that insights, here are some general campaign options that you should be thinking of. So if I was to just minimize it, it kind of breaks it out into 4. Sometimes it comes up with 2, but it gives me general like, hey, it's not just the idea, but it says if you were to run this, it all simulates like you can expect based on past performances what these numbers would be, what these conversions would be. Now, this is not make this is dependent on the data you feed it. So there's a lot of unstructured data you can feed it. There's a lot of structured data you can feed it to be able to then say, hey, here are past performances. Here's generally how I've seen conversions on specific channels, and so on and so forth. So I'm able to then see, hey, you know what, I've got a few of these, and I'm going across these. Looks like this first time visitor trust builder suggestion that it has is giving me probably the highest new customers. I'm going to be biased towards that, and I'm going to say, hey, you know what, I actually would like to use that one. I'm going to be like, hey, listen, let's actually select this campaign. And now just you kind of finish that planning phase, right? You're kind of iterating through the idea, and you can continue to iterate. But once you finish that planning stage, you're then going into that execution mode where the first step is audience creation. The second step is how do I now target these folks? So when I select that campaign idea and then say, hey, that actually makes sense for me, this says, hey, there are two audiences that I suggest. I can add additional audiences if, again, based on my experience, I can then say, here is who I want to include, exclude. I can edit these. I can continue talking with my AI agent to edit this and ideate through the audiencing strategy as well, if I want to understand the cohort and so on and so forth. But for now, let's say that these are the two. I'm looking at those folks who are coming through sponsored clicks and those folks who are organically coming to the site. And I know that these make most of my visitors. So let me start looking at how do I target these folks. And then I say, okay, you know what? I like these two ideas. Can you give me a suggestion of what treatment I should run for these two folks? And here is where it's creating a journey in the back end. And it's saying, by the way, this journey is giving you a general stats on what you can expect. But this is generally the process. It's saying it's a combination of both owned and paid media. There's some information in here where it kind of gets into more details. I can iterate through this idea and say, you know what, everything looks great. I've kind of finished my execution setup or configuration. I say, hey, go and run this, right? And so now you kind of finish that second step of execution. Now the third step, which is measurement. Okay, I'm running these campaigns. Now I did run this ahead of time, so I have some general stats inside of this UI. So I can go into my measurement. I can see, hey, across all my campaigns, what am I seeing? But I'm more interested in that campaign that I just made live. And because I ran before, I'm able to see some general stats that I get back from the campaign itself. Now, where we are headed to next is that execution optimization or feedback loop coming back into planning, where you see these 3 key insights. How do we take these insights from a running campaign, from a live campaign, and then adjust and edit that process or that journey or the audience definition in some cases to be able to then optimize for spend, optimize for the objective that you set up at the start. And so, again, kind of going back, Zach, to some of those things, a lot of this is definitely first party, but some of this data is also coming from partners and organizations like yours.
Totally. Yeah. Just to jump in on a few things here. One, this kind of work would be weeks and weeks and weeks of coordination of time and cycles to get at, right? The campaign ideation, the campaign recommendation, the journeys, ideation and design and recommendation. So what you just did in 5 minutes that's multiple weeks to be able to get at that, right? The other is, the blending of owned and paid in that design, right? I think there is a great promise in the CDP to really accelerate that. And again, even though there's the functional capability, it hasn't scaled because of the complexity, right? Because it's just the relative kind of framing of a personalized journey on a one-to-one basis. How do you design that, right?
Yeah.
How do you ideate relative to signals coming in that are relative to the journey? How can you do that, right? That's at the core of why it hasn't scaled, right? And so the CDP as the engine for that mid-bottom funnel retargeting, right? When your user sees ad, they respond to the ad, they click on the site, they become pseudo-anonymized in the first-party context. Maybe you drive them into some kind of newsletter sign-up. Maybe you join them into a known previous customer, right? That's what Axiom could do, a lot of that underlying ID recognition and matching. And then we can enrich that with our graph data to just further facilitate and optimize that process, right? But that really gets at the nut of both why we're plateaued and how we can unlock that, right? So very excited.
Yeah.
Very excited. Yeah.
So I know we have only about 8 more minutes here. I would love to continue this conversation. You and I joked about this as we were preparing and doing our research for this, that we could probably spend days talking about this topic. But Scott, are there any questions? Maybe we could take one, probably two.
Sure. Yeah, there's a couple of really good questions here from the audience. First one, they're asking, do you have suggestions for how marketers can use AI to sift through data and identify microsegments that the traditional targeting methods overlook?
Yeah, Zach, you want to take that, and I can add color.
That's a big one. That goes back to some of Joe's points on you need an ability to collect and synthesize the intent signal, the contextual-based intent signal to infer, is this person in market? What are they in market for? And so that really very much is all in the context of are they qualified, and is the timing right relative to that developing some kind of communication or experience to that person, right? So AI in the context of being able to take just this raw signal, right? AI in the context of being able to curate like IDs that programmatic addressable IDs that allow you to munge to that data, to allow then the ability to create the microsegment, then allow the ability then to address, right? So there's AI in the context of just the raw signal extrapolation and harmonization and synthesis. And then there is getting that into a some workflow or some interface for a marketer can then to workflow on, and that's the CDP. And then again, there it goes into, okay, then what do I do, right? And so what is the messaging? What is the creative? What is the channel mix? What's the appropriate sequence of messaging and at the right frequency and the timing? What is the right investment of media dollars relative to the qualification, relative to the purchase point, et cetera, right? And so AI and being able to kind of sort of synthesize and munge that, all those crazy amount of touch points to be able to then get into the ability then to orchestrate and activate the microsegment, right? And then again, and then the addressability of that microsegment. How do you use it? How do you accomplish that, right? How do you reach them in programmatic and walled gardens and whatnot, right? Then how do you connect those journeys as they go from sort of the third party space into the first party space, and then go into what Joe just showed, right? Then converge them into sort of a journey that then can start blending paid and email together, as example, right? So AI and all those pieces are just unlocks, right?
And just to add to what Zach's mentioning, right? Like, so if you think about traditional segmentation, which is your age, demographics, channel typically, or preference of channel, and some signals that you would typically get, that I would classify as traditional segmentation. But then when we think about how AI kind of helps with that, is like, hey, how do we identify patterns where we say, oh, people actually abandon 2-3 times before they actually make a make a purchase, right? Or maybe after abandoning 2-3 times, there is a price drop, and now if you run a campaign, there's very high chance of conversion. There are certain things where you can use AI to detect high consideration of, let's say, a particular product only after a certain time in the day, right? So if you're kind of in that moment and you know that this is that type of or that type of individual or that type of person, you then provide some personalization in that moment, right? So that we call that AI clustering, right, based on these behavioral patterns and not necessarily just demo, right? So that's one.
That's right.
Uh,
That's right.
the other one that is pretty cool is then how do we analyze unstructured data, right? How do we look at feedback? How do we look at the way they interact, let's say, with a chatbot or the way they interact with the call center? I mean, if we are able to access social media comments, how are they writing about certain things or reviews, right? And then sort of create these semantic themes within audiences. And the semantic themes could be price anxious shoppers or users researching for alternatives, right? Or people who are impulse buyers based on specific trends that are occurring, right? So these are things that are signals that live in that unstructured world typically, right? On how they are interacting with the brand. So
That's right.
that would be another one. And then there are these micro moments that you need. That this is something that Jack kind of talked about as well, is like it also is not always about who, it's about when. So how do you use those signals to create those micro moments rather than these static groups when you're targeting, right? So those I would say are key to be able to then say, well, here are now my signal amplifiers, and how do I then use these signal amplifiers or traits to be able to then dramatically change the outcomes that I'm looking for, right? So that's how I would envision you could leverage AI and intelligence to be able to drive these campaigns.
All right. Well, I think Zach, you mentioned that we're just sort of in the early days here. There's so much more to talk about here, but unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks for a great discussion. This has been really interesting and it's exciting where you guys are pushing this. Really appreciate your time.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Joe.
Thanks, Zach.
All right. All right. I'm going to let you guys get on with your busy days, and just going to wrap up a couple of things here. Before we get to the prize drawing, we have one quick favor to ask of you all today. So Arena's opening up a short survey. We'd really appreciate it if you could all fill out. So this is just for those of us on the Smart Brief team. We just want to know how we're doing, what y'all like and don't like about our sessions. Really want to make sure we're meeting your needs. So the results of this survey are going to affect how we deliver these events for you in the future. So we'll give you all just a minute to fill that out. While you're doing that, I do want to remind everybody before we close up here today is that there is that great resource, that guide in the docs section. So if you didn't get a chance to open up that tab so that you preserve that resource after the event ends, this is your last chance to do that. And we do have one more piece of business. That's the prize giveaway. Today's winner of a $250 Amazon gift card is Dinah Barazin from Texas. So congratulations to Dinah. As always, we'll be in touch about claiming your prize after the event. Well, with that, on behalf of the Smart Brief team, I want to thank Uniphore for making this event possible. Giant thank you to Joe and Zach for just a really, really interesting chat. And a big thank you to everybody in the audience for joining us. And thanks for your questions and engaging in the chat. It was great having you all here for this Smart Brief event. We look forward to seeing you again next time. Have a fantastic rest of your day.